Welcome to this episode of CEO Perspectives, a signature series by the Conference Board. CEO Perspectives are conversations that take an objective, nonpartisan look at a range of timely topics that matter most to business leaders. To help make sense of these topics and how they'll unfold, we'll sit down with thought leaders and do what we do best at the Conference Board, provide trusted insights for what's ahead. I'm Steve Odland, the CEO of the Conference Board and the host of this series. And in today's conversation, we're going to discuss how to build a resilient and sustainable energy grid. What are the technologies needed and what investments need to be prioritized? And what should businesses and government be doing to prepare for a carbon-free future? I'm very pleased to welcome George Kirby to this conversation today. George is the CEO of RS Technologies. George, welcome to the program.
Steve, thanks so much for having me on.
So you're, of course, CEO of RS Technologies. Tell us a little bit about what RS does and your career experience and what's brought you to this stage.
So RS Technologies is all about elevating the world's electric grids. We produce some of the best composite utility structures in the world. We put these into all aspects of the grid, whether it's distribution or transmission. My background is actually, or my training was originally in composites when I went to school for aerospace engineering many years ago, decades ago. I studied composite structures during a time when the field was developing at a lightning pace. Since then, I haven't really done a lot with composites until recently. I've held senior leadership positions focused on the electric utility industry. While I was at GE, I spent time in product development and then sales focused around different aspects of power generation, whether it was thermal generation or renewable energy. When I was with GE Capital, we developed, built, and invested in thermal and renewable power plants. I later went on to focus on transmission and distribution technologies, whether it was offering solutions or focused on engineering, construction services to actually build these facilities. Prior to RS, I actually was president and CEO of an ocean renewables company, and I had time to spend, or I actually spent time with offshore oil and gas customers focused on the challenges of powering subsea systems. This has given me perspective in my career. I've been able to see the energy industry from wellhead to wall socket, as we used to say at GE. There's never been a better time to be with a company like RS Technologies. I just knew this was the right place to be at the right time. There's never been a greater need for electric infrastructure investment than today.
Yeah, and so all of your experiences, I mean, you think about it, and from GE to RS, it's all about the energy future of our country, but really from production all the way to now distribution. So you are truly the right person to be talking about all of this. So we've set a goal as a nation, and many nations around the world to get to carbon neutrality. And as part of that, there's a lot of stuff, if I can just say that generally, a lot of stuff that needs to happen in this country in order to get there. You can't just shut off fossil fuels and snap your fingers and make it happen. Describe for us, in your opinion, the kinds of infrastructure needs that we have to invest in.
So, Steve, great question. It needs to be an all of the above strategy, first and foremost. As you pointed out, we can't just simply get rid of carbon and thermal energy. But let's face it, renewable energy is the hot topic today. Just look at the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Act and where those public dollars are flowing to advance decarbonization. But an important point is to reach those 2050 renewable goals, we'll need to totally overhaul our grid. And what I mean by the grid is our transmission and distribution infrastructure, whether it's poles, whether it's the wires called conductors, or all the equipment that helps, flow the power to customers. For example, today, there's about 600,000 miles of transmission in the US. we're going to have to, in order to meet our 2050 renewable goals, we're going to have to grow those transmission miles by 6 times to 3.6 million miles. That's just astronomical. And that's on top of the 140,000 miles of transmission lines that simply need to be replaced because they're old, because they're aging. But Steve, this really begs the point that today's investments in renewables are only as good as the distribution network that actually delivers the power to the end users. Last year alone, the US had $20 billion of weather and climate disaster events. One storm, Category 4, Hurricane Ida, last year cost one utility over 30,000 poles. That's nearly twice as many as Hurricane Katrina took.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it really shows the, you know, the vulnerability of the grid. You know, you mentioned renewables, and of course, you know, you can't listen to a newscast or open a newspaper without reading about, you know, the need for renewables. But, you know, when people talk renewables, of course, they talk about wind and solar, but it just help us understand, you know, not all of our listeners are experts at this, help us understand the full range of renewable energy, you know, all the production techniques.
So renewable energy is most well known for solar, rooftop or distributed solar, utility scale, as well as wind. And wind is also distributed, but you also have big utility scale plants. But there's also ocean power as well. And there's different ways to harness the ocean waves, for instance. Nuclear power is considered renewable as well. Geothermal is an area that I focused on when I was at GE as well. Geothermal power is prevalent in the ring of fire geographies of the world. So, you know, it's more than just wind and solar, and there's more and more coming online as well. Hydrogen today is becoming all the rage. You know, there's different grades of hydrogen, and hydrogen comes at a cost, but it is considered a quasi-renewable energy as well.
Yeah, and hydro is in there as you know,
Hydro
as part of that as well. So, you know, there are a lot of techniques here that, you know, the challenge with any of these renewable technologies are, except nuclear, are that they're, you know, we're dependent on nature, right? And the episodic quality of wind or, you know, or solar. And so, you know, there does need to be a base load provided, you know, like from something like nuclear or a combination of nuclear, hydro, and some of these other sources, right?
Absolutely. You know, energy storage or battery energy storage plays a big part. And with the advancement of new chemistries for battery technologies, this is becoming more and more prevalent. In fact, the use of battery energy storage is absolutely critical to pair with some of our renewable energy generation technologies in order to make that real.
Yeah, I mean, if you could imagine, you know, a small solar panel, if you could miniaturize it with the battery in the basement, you could run every house that way. But I think we're a long way away from that, which does then come back to your point that we have a lot of need for investment in basic R&D.
Absolutely. And, you know, I'm not sure that we just need better energy storage technology. There's still a long road to travel with battery technology, if you will. And that too is developing at a rapid pace. But we need to enable these storage technologies to be deployed at scale. So typically your more modular energy storage technologies will be more useful. You know, while home battery storage units add to overall decarbonization goals, they really need two things in order to grow: access to capital and grid architecture in place. And that's really what we're focused on at RS Technologies, is creating or replacing, depending on the situation, a resilient grid architecture so that we can actually get the power to the end user. Right now, the grid structure that we have in the US and North America as a whole is extremely fragile, especially with you know, increasing weather events happening. Just last week in Florida, Hurricane Ian, one of the worst hurricanes in history, and the damage is just unprecedented. It's going to take months for us to, in many places there, restore the electric power grid because it's so fragile.
Yes, it is interesting. People say, well, every time you have one of these storms, whether it's a tornado or, straight line winds or something, it knocks trees knock into the poles and the wires, and it takes the power grid down. Why don't we just bury everything? I think I know the answer.
Yeah, two big reasons there. Number one, it's very difficult to actually bury underground power lines. One of my prior roles, I worked very closely with PSEG with their Northeast Grid Reliability Program, and a major effort was put into undergrounding where we could. And you run into right-of-way issues. There's a lot more buried underground already that you have to bypass in order to get that done. The other reason I think is a bit more obvious, it's cost. It's just, in some cases, it's 10 times more expensive to bury power lines than it is to simply replace the overhead lines with better, more resilient equipment.
Yeah, and so these are the challenges that we have, and everybody says, well, just bury them, but it's not easy to do that, as you say. All right, so let's go back a little bit. So you mentioned nuclear as a renewable, which is interesting because it doesn't emit carbon, it's not petroleum based, and yet it has been ostracized, for a long time here. And I think basically out of fear, I don't know if you'd agree, George, but basically out of fear. And I think people are coming back to nuclear and particularly distributed nuclear as a real source here of a baseload renewable. How do you see it?
Well, I have to say I'm a little bit biased because I cut my teeth in the nuclear industry. I've been in and out of nuclear power plants a large part of my early career. From what I saw and experienced, it was incredibly safe here in the United States. But after Fukushima and the fallout there's been a real hesitancy. But I think down the road, my opinion, it's inevitable that nuclear will continue to be part of the energy portfolio. There's constant innovation around, as you mentioned, distributed nuclear. I think we're still a ways off there. But these are things that have been looked at and focused on for years. I think the key, though, is investment. And it's not just investment dollars from funds and investors up front. It's investment by end users. It's investment by communities, recognizing that we can't keep solving the same problems over with the same materials, the same solutions. We need to pursue big, disruptive, revolutionary changes in the way that we think and the solutions that we bring to the table. That's a lot of what we're doing here at RS with our technology. In many ways, we're disrupting the utility distribution and transmission structure market with composites. There's just huge opportunity to rebuild the grid in a resilient way that can reliably last for 100 years or more, instead of using the same wood or steel technology that we have for centuries.
Yeah. You mentioned Fukushima, and the issue there wasn't nuclear power. The issue there was they were hit by a tsunami, and the plant was not designed to be hit by a tsunami, so it was an environmental thing. And Chernobyl was a construction flaw. So the accidents that have happened have been a result of where they put them or how they've actually cut corners in the building. So it is relatively safe. The storage of spent material has been something that has been debated for a long time because you want to control that and you don't want it to fall into the hands of the wrong people, but there are solutions for that too. So I think you're right. I think we really do need to get on this and get this going here, because if you don't have the capacity, the transmission, the power capacity, you really can't put all of this extra load on it, in addition to everything that you said about the grid.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And when we look at Fukushima, it wasn't the tidal wave, it was the lack of planning for the tidal wave, I think, as you pointed out. And this is the shift that's happening with utilities and independent power producers. we're starting to recognize that these climatic events are real, they're happening more frequently, and we've got to build them into our planning and our infrastructure designs. And utilities are doing that today. The grid hardening programs that most of the investor-owned utilities are executing today are unprecedented. Billions and billions of dollars are being funneled over decades for these programs to essentially replace and rebuild with much more resilient systems and materials. Again, it's actually a movement that we're seeing in the energy industry.
We're discussing the growth of renewable energy and the need for investment in production and the grid. We're going to take a short break and we'll be right back.
As you and your company monitor the latest wave of shocks that have battered the U.S. economy, the award-winning forecast team at the Conference Board now predicts a recession by the end of 2022. This recession will further compound the crises that have recently upended original expectations, from a deadly pandemic to a war in Ukraine and the highest inflation in decades. Yet, unprecedented crises also present unforeseen opportunities if you have a trusted, proven navigator by your side. With that in mind, and as the Conference Board has always done, we are providing you with daily, timely, and relevant content that will guide the business community through the economic storm. These trusted insights are being gathered on our website and are available to help your company master the challenges ahead. Visit us at conference-board.org/topics/recession. Then, on November 29th, join us for a live virtual briefing from our economists and other financial experts. It's complimentary to you and your colleagues. Register now on our website to hear the latest on weathering this economic turbulence.
Welcome back to CEO Perspectives. I'm your host, Steve Odland, the CEO of the Conference Board, and I'm joined today by George Kirby, the CEO of RS Technologies. George, I want to go back to battery storage because, once again, you cannot really level the load here with renewables without adequate storage. As you've said, one of the issues with battery technology is the reliance on rare earth minerals. And, we have them in this country, but we won't allow miners to dig. So therefore, we're reliant on rogue regimes and, bad places in the world. Talk about what you know about battery technology and the future of it. I'm hearing that maybe there's sodium technology coming, which would, there's salt everywhere. That would be relatively cheap. But what do you hear?
It's interesting that you mentioned sodium technology. One of the very first investment opportunities that I investigated with a team when at GE Capital was salt energy storage or thermal storage, where you actually heat up the salt to a molten level, and then that heat that's stored will actually convert water to steam and run a steam turbine to generate power. It's been around forever, and it's also a very reliable and predictable form of energy storage. Rare earth materials are a big issue today. We all know where the majority of rare earth metals sit. And, what we do have that I understand is the opportunity to explore domestically here in the US, things like lithium and other technologies. Cobalt coming from Africa is a hot topic today as well. Materials are an absolute issue in propagating the technology of battery storage. But again, to my point earlier, without a resilient grid to support it, energy storage isn't going to matter.
Yeah, you're so right. It's production and the grid. Okay, so you mentioned some of the storms that we've seen, Hurricane Ian most recently. But given these weather events, which have been happening forever and will happen forever, we simply need to have investment here to harden this grid. What is the gap between where we are today and what you see would be necessary to have a truly hardened grid? A gap in either technology or investments or all the above?
It's absolutely investments. And as I pointed out, we're seeing unprecedented investment in infrastructure in the electric side. I'll give you an idea of really what we're up against and the fragility of our grid right now. The grid's broken down into two groups, transmission and distribution. Right now, there's about 175 million distribution poles in North America. The vast majority are made of wood, and half of these wood poles are 40 years or older. It's hard to fathom, but actually 35% are 60 years or older. Wood experiences rot, damage from insects, woodpeckers, believe it or not. On the transmission side, there's 25 million transmission structures in North America. And the majority are made of wood and are over 40 years old as well. Spend today is for end of life replacement. So it's those older structures is where a large part of the spend is coming from. In fact, utilities replace primarily with wood, again, about 2 million poles a year. So spend on poles alone in North America is a $16 billion a year market.
Wow.
It's just, it's crazy. And that's poles in North America alone. And that includes annual replacements, grid hardening programs, the net zero grid initiatives we're talking about, as well as catch-up spend that we're undergoing because there's been a lot of neglect over the years.
So what do you think the investment gap is between where we are and where we'd like to be with a hardened grid?
When you look at the grid hardening programs that are underway in North America, US, it's unprecedented. There is a decades-long effort that needs to happen here. So when we talk about our 2050 net zero carbon goal for the US, we also have over the next 3 decades, grid hardening that needs to happen because of these extreme weather events.
Yeah, but it's hundreds of billions of dollars that
it's hundreds of billions of dollars, absolutely.
And so what's the, we talk about utilities, and I think most consumers think of utilities as these private companies that are out there just to make a profit, and they're, they look at their bills and they just assume that somebody's rolling in the dough here. But there a lot of utilities are government owned or municipally owned. Some are independent, but there needs to be a government and a private sector effort here, doesn't there?
Absolutely, and there is currently. I mean, when you look at the complexity of the U.S. energy system, there's state, local, regulatory, and even regional, cross-state and cross-province in Canada, regulatory bodies that oversee the way that our utilities and our infrastructure is invested in, the way it's run. We work with, and our customers work with, public utility commissions. The commissions are usually state-based, and they are the ones that essentially set the rates that ratepayers like you and I pay for our electricity. There are examples out there where these PUCs are mandating investment in new technologies because of real threats that are in front of us, like wildfires out in the West. The California Public Utility Commission is a perfect example. They actually mandated that composite poles are used in high wildfire risk areas. So there's a massive program going on with those utilities in California to replace wood with composite, which naturally extinguishes in wildfires.
Yeah, and this is just so important. Do you see that some of these poles are being replaced with wood still?
Still, unfortunately, they are. And the challenge with wood, wood's been used since the mid-1800s. It is probably one of the longest used technologies to date, but still being used today. The challenge is a lot of the old growth forests have been depleted. So now they're tapping into new growth forests, and the strength and stiffness that's needed for existing technologies and loads really isn't there, let alone the increased loads that we're seeing with bringing on EV charging. I mean, consider if every garage in America has an electric vehicle and is being charged, what the infrastructure load needs to be in order to support that. That all goes up on top of poles. So our existing wood technology just not capable of carrying that.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned it because you have California now and New York who are going to outlaw internal combustion engines and, saying, great, we want 100% electric cars. Well, there's a lot of rare earth minerals in that. There's the same issues with the battery technology. They're expensive. But it was ironic that 2 days after their announcement in California, they then asked people to stop charging their cars because they didn't have enough capacity to charge them.
Yeah, it's a bit of a circular issue. And while it's great to set big, lofty goals to really motivate communities and industry as a whole, there's just so much that goes into it. California has water problems, they have electric problems, and to add on to that, mandates for EVs and EV charging just really exacerbates the challenge and puts industry at the ready to be able to address these, but that all takes time. It takes investment. I mentioned disruptive technologies before. When you look at evolutionary technologies or evolutionary design changes and revolutionary, it's the evolutionary design changes that end up taking more time. They cost more because they take more time. More investment has to be put into revolutionary designs and revolutionary technologies, just like they're doing with battery storage, as you pointed out earlier.
Yeah, and it comes back to where we started. You need a plan. I mean, you can't evolve. You can't evolutionary technology. You can't evolve unless you have a plan. I mean, we now have set a goal, but you see people just trying to shut off access to or make carbon-based technologies so expensive. But you need a goal, and you need a plan, and you need the investment to get there, which is your point. I want to come back to your disruptive technology because you have 20 years of experience in commercializing and deploying disruptive technology. It seems to me that all big leaps forward, which is what this would require some level of disruptive technology. Talk about what you see in the pipeline. And maybe some of it's fanciful. I don't know. It's not necessarily close, but what do you see coming down the road?
Yeah, Steve, great question. To solve big world problems, we need big world solutions. And we've all heard about the big data movement that's been going on now for a decade or more. And that's really no different than in the electric utility industry. Big data is all about understanding our environment and the conditions of our assets. When you think about extreme weather events, you could imagine having smart structures that are out there that are giving feedback around how they're reacting to these hurricanes that are rolling through. So one example is to incorporate sensor technology into everything that we provide. Condition-based maintenance, condition-based replacement. We become more proactive than reactive. Instead of replacing things when they break, we anticipate and forecast when they're going to need to be maintained or replaced, and then we do it. It becomes a more proactive approach, and that all feeds into safety, quality of life for communities.
Yeah. And clearly here we need government and business to work hand in hand. You need regulatory reform. You need government to resolve whether we're going to use our own natural resources. So there's a lot of policy debates and decisions coming in order to facilitate this whole transition.
Absolutely. And while these policymaking procedures could always be better, I mean, it's important for everybody to remember the complexity of the situation that we're dealing with. We've been talking about all the aspects. And the necessary regulatory bodies that are over top of these decision-making processes as well. Right.
George, thanks so much for joining us today and sharing all of your insights on the grid, the energy situation, and in carbon-free 2050.
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate you having me on.
And thanks to all of you for listening in to CEO Perspectives. Every week, I'll be joined by an expert to provide thought leadership and insights on the issues of our time. We'll cover the leading topics in economics, public policy, ESG, human capital, and more. Please share CEO Perspectives with your colleagues, your friends, I know that they'll want to listen. I'm Steve Odland, and this series has been brought to you by the Conference Board.